now we'd like to hear from Dr. Arline Bronzaft.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing before the group, and I think my comments will be a little different since I actually do the research and not just review it. While applauding the benefits of wind turbine energy, some people have raised questions as to whether this newly developed energy source may have adverse effects on nearby residents. Employing my experience as a professor of nearly 40 years for the City University of New York, and a researcher conducting research on noise impacts for the same period of time, I'm going to address whether the knowledge so far attained by the potential impact of wind turbine noise's health is grounded in the kind of research that will allow definitive answers. And included in this discussion will be my own personal experience exploring the impacts of noise on mental and physical health, which will include my landmark research on the effects of noise on children's learning, my studies on the effects of airport-related noise, and in a book that I recently published with 4 British co-authors, it also will include the knowledge attained from studying the other studies in the area, including the impacts of wind turbine noise. Now, 50 years ago, when people complained that secondhand smoke was harmful to their health, they were largely dismissed. As a person suffering from allergies and asthma, I know what it's like to be ridiculed, and I know how I felt all those years about my telling people that I was being sickened by their noise. Today, I turn on television, I see a mother smoking, and in that ad, they clearly state that her smoke might lead to her child's illness. 40 years ago, a group of parents in the city of New York complained that the noise from passing trains interfered with their children's learning in a school adjacent to subway tracks. In other words, they told their parents they were bothered, they were annoyed by the noise. These parents were dismissed. However, when I conducted a study of the effects of train noise on these children and found that children exposed to elevated train noise were nearly a year behind in reading by the 6th grade compared to the children on the quiet side of the building, attention was paid. Yes, it was published in a peer-reviewed journal. When the Transit Authority and the Board of Education worked together to install acoustic treatments to lessen the effects of noise on classroom learning, I was asked to come back and conduct another study to see if now in a quieter classroom, children were doing better. And then when I compared the children exposed to the noise, now that it was lessened, with children on the quiet side, guess what? It turned out the children were able to learn better. In the first case, they were nearly a year behind in reading, and that is significant. Today, at least 30 studies have confirmed that children cannot study or learn in a classroom in which noise intrudes upon the learning and the teaching, may I add. Noise impedes classroom learning. Noise in general was viewed when I first started talking about it as annoying, but its deleterious effects on mental and physical health are backed today by a large body of research. At the very least, noise diminishes quality of life, and good health is not merely the absence of symptoms. Good health, according to the World Health Organization, necessitates a decent quality of life. Now, how do we gather scientific evidence to determine the hazardous effects of unwanted sounds from aircraft, trains, or wind turbines, or for that matter, how are scientific data collected to determine the adverse impacts of environmental pollution? Before research moves to questionnaires and correlated data, it often starts with interviews of people who might be complaining. Then we do content analyses of these interviews. This leads to the development of formal questionnaires, which are then distributed to large numbers of people. Then we move on to collect correlated data. And at this point, we have to be very careful about the methodology because we want to be able to declare that our findings are statistically significant. However, We do not disregard complaints, and we don't argue that samples are small when investigations start. My work on classroom noise intruding on learning started with parental complaints. My research on test anxiety on students started when students complained to me as a professor that noise was intruding on their performance on their exams. This led to the development of a questionnaire, and then I was able to conduct studies on the effects of test anxiety on students' learning. I also responded to criticisms of New York City riders when a 1970 subway map was declared by them to be too difficult to use. They were not able to navigate the system by using this map. This then led to a study in which I asked people to go through the system, and they were new to New Yorkers, and see if they can get to the various stops by using the map. After that study was published, peer-reviewed journal, the Transit Authority decided to form a map committee and to include people who actually knew about maybe how people respond to a situation in a subway system and not just be a graphic designer. And I'm very proud to serve on that committee. The map came out in 1979. It's still being used with some revisions. So now when we speak of the impacts of wind turbines, we learn that some people living near these turbines are voicing complaints about the sounds, complaining that the sounds disturb their sleep, make them nervous, irritable, and have headaches. In response to such complaints, Nina Pierpont interviewed individuals living near the wind turbines and wrote of their distress and discomfort. Studies were then undertaken to examine these impacts, and some reports have acknowledged that some people may be affected by low-frequency sounds, and this may have an impact on their health. However, other researchers have dismissed the impact on these people, saying that the number is small and should not be weighted largely when judging the overall impacts of wind turbine sounds on people. Also, statements are frequently added that further research on the potential harm of wind turbines are not warranted. Now, let us look at the word some. That may mean a small number, but even if the number is small, should we ignore the needs of people who are affected? In so many areas of medicine, it is only a small number who may be adversely affected by some element of the environment. Yet scientists and doctors would never say that these people should be dismissed or forgotten. Secondly, Dr. Piermont's interviews have been criticized for being too few and not scientific evidence. However, as noted above, interviews are the starting point, and then we move from them with more thorough studies. Sigmund Freud, who started what I would call interviews of his patients before he moved into the development of theories, and which later could be tested, was considered one of the great minds of the 20th century. His interviews carried weight. Do you really think at this early stage of wind as a source of energy, there's no room to explore the potential impacts of sounds, including the low-frequency ones on people living nearby? At this early stage, do you really believe that we have always employed the proper assessment of the sounds? Have we examined the full range of sounds, including low frequency? And as Dr. Leventhal said in a 2004 paper, quote, regulatory authorities must accept that annoyance by low-frequency noise presents a real problem which is not addressed by the commonly used assessment methods, end of quote. This statement raises a question as to whether the range of turbine sounds explored in these studies, reporting no effects, have been adequately assessed, and I believe Les Bloomberg addressed the issue as to how we measure noise when he spoke here last. Nate Seltenrich, in his article, Wind Turbines, A Different Breed of Noise, published in Environmental Health Perspectives in January, wrote that with large-scale wind turbines being a recent innovation, there is sparse research on the impacts of turbine sound, leaving the issue unsettling. Mr. Seltenrich also reports in his paper that much of the research on the impacts of noise has been conducted outside the United States. I wish to add that in a Federal Aviation Administration funded paper written by Hale Swift in 2010, entitled Review of Literature Related to Potential Health Effects of Aircraft Noise, he concluded as follows, quote, "A great deal of research remains to be done in the field of health effects of noise. This conclusion can be partially explained by the fact in discussing the application on noise impacts and health conducted in Europe, the author states, quote, there are also questions as to whether the results are directly transferable from a collection of a European population to an American one, end of quote. He actually says this twice in the paper. However, he does not provide possible hypotheses as to why it would be inappropriate to generalize from European studies. But with Mr. Seltenrich stating the wind turbine research is largely conducted out of the United States, Europe, Australia, and now we're depending a great deal on Canada. I'm very proud of that. I am half Canadian. And Mr. Swift questioning whether European noise research can be applied to American populations, I raise the question as to the applicability of these references to European studies. I am raising the question. I'm not giving you my personal opinion. However, Mr. Seltenrich and Mr. Swift support my conclusion that more research is needed. This conclusion is underscored by the haste with which we in the United States introduce new products, new medicines, and new inventions without fully exploring the possible negative effects. We tend to promote their positive contributions to our well-being, but only after they are adopted do we find that some of them have negative impacts as well. Unfortunately, too little research was done on their potential harm. For example, recently we learned that Ambien tends to last longer in women than men. And even more recently we're told that women were not part of the population tested when this drug was being developed. When drugs are now advertised on television, the side effects listed often make you to forget the positive effects of the drugs being promoted. While it's true that fewer numbers of people experience the negative impacts rather than the positive, these numbers are still substantial. But I want to turn to something very interesting now, a situation when individual complaints were taken seriously without solid scientific evidence. A New York Times page 1 article on June 27 by Catherine St. Louis entitled Politicians' Prescriptions for Marijuana Doctors and Data addresses to the issue as to whether there was sufficient data to support legislation that allowed medical marijuana to alleviate symptoms from a myriad of disorders. This article quotes authorities as saying that these are anecdotes that suggest marijuana is a treatment for these disorders. They are not solid data. The article goes on to say, quote, advocates contend that suffering people should not have to wait for scientific research to catch up to patients' needs, end of quote. I raise this example to illustrate a situation in which people's complaints were taken seriously. Scientific research has not yet confirmed that these certain illnesses will be helped by marijuana. And this is in line with Dr. William Stewart, former Surgeon General of the United States, when he said in a 1969 conference on noise as a public health hazard, quote, must we wait until we prove every link in a chain of causation? In protecting health, absolute proof comes late. To wait for it is to invite disaster or to prolong suffering longer. End of quote. Now I'd like to raise a question to Dr. Olson, who in a review referred to my article, The Noise from Wind Turbines, Potential Adverse on Children's Well-Being in the Bulletin of Science, Technology, and Society in 2011. He said I employed, quotes, fallacious comparisons, which implies I was engaging in misleading and deceptive behavior. The paper, however, did not point out how I was engaging in such falsehoods, which sort of left the reader with the impression that I tend to mislead people, and I do have a reputation of having worked in the field for 40 years. However, When I'm criticized, I never take it that personally, because I always question whether the other person has criticized others in a similar manner. And of course, in this case, my generalization was appropriate, because in a paper written by Brett Horner, in which he audited the references cited by Knopper and Olson, he questioned the accuracy and completeness and objectivity of their literature reviews. And I think we have to be cautious about reviews. So that when we come to look at the adverse impact of wind turbines on mental and physical health, we cannot at this stage conclude that wind turbines are not related to adverse health impacts. This is comparable to the statements we received from the tobacco industry and their researches about smoking when I was growing up. I'd also like to praise New York City Transit Authority and Board of Education for lessening train noise without asking for additional studies, or claiming that the children attending Public School 98 were too few and that I needed larger samples to support the effects of noise on children's learning. One study, and there was action taken, and the noise was lessened. And no, we did not get rid of our trains, we just corrected the noise problem. So, and additionally, by the way, 30 studies have followed, and they have found that children are adversely affected by noise in their classrooms. Additionally, the Federal Aviation Administration, recognizing the potential adverse impacts of transportation noise, such as studies that I have conducted and others, introduced a program to abate noise at schools situated near airports. This year, a paper has been published by the National Academy of Sciences, which reported that such abatement was beneficial to students studying at schools near the nation's airports. So they lessened the noise near the airports. I was very proud to be part of the panel overseeing it. Now, to my last paragraph. Additionally, from the time the parent in my classroom, 40 years ago, complained about a child's attending a school intruded upon by train noise, to today, when people in New York City, the rest of the country, and internationally complain to me about their noise problems, I have listened attentively to their complaints and have never dismissed anybody by telling them to get used to the noise. As a trained psychologist, I listen to complaints, note that it's not some but many people who are intruded upon by noise, recognize that getting used to means adapting to the noise, which requires expending bodily energy. And then as an environmental psychologist, I use my skills to lessen the intrusive noise. I speak today not only as a researcher and writer, but as an individual who has responded to citizen complaints for many years, especially the last 26 as a mayoral appointment appointed to the Council on the Environment of New York City. So I would really urge this group possibly to follow as Health Canada and conduct some of their own reviews of the literature or the study, and I am looking forward to reading David Medchild's study from Health Canada. But I would like to see that parties who may have different views, people who may see that there are no impacts, people that believe there are impacts, it's always good to sit down and talk. I consider myself a reasonable person. Otherwise, the Transit Authority, after I criticized their system, would not have asked me to be a consultant to them in the area of noise. So it's with reason that I think we should discuss this. And the one thing I do say, you don't move ahead without recognizing you must not do harm. Precipitous activity has often led to very serious adverse conclusions. I thank you very much.